has to do with at a community level. Um, at a community level, it is really hard to try to identify the source of the odors, but the odors cause a lot of problems in the community. So identifying sometimes sites are close together and it is difficult to determine which site is causing the odor. Or if you ask at the site if their operations are having any trouble, normally the answer is no, we're operating under normal conditions, but we still have the odors. So does that mean that under normal conditions, odors will be present for the community? Or maybe it's the transportation or transmission of the odors that it's something that needs to be better understood in terms of like wind direction will cause odors to reach the community at sometimes and sometimes not, weather conditions, the intensity of the odors. There's a big difference if the odor is a minimal compared to if it is a strong odor. What is happening at the source to make these changes of the intensity of the odors, the length of the event, all those questions that are difficult at a community level to assess and to determine where the odor is coming from, why we are having the odors, what can be done to not have the odors. And the other thing that is a huge unknown in the community is that when you have an odor, does that mean that it is harmful for you? Or is the odor something that will not produce any health effects? Or maybe it is a conditioned effect on you, that not a physical or chemical problem, but as more like a psychological thing that could be happening. So okay. Those are
good.
The unknown.
So great questions, good. I know we have someone talking about community odor monitoring right after lunch, I believe it is. So if someone here did have anything they wanted to add to that, otherwise, a great question. I think Ray Porter, when he comes up, may be able to, he's nodding his head that, yep, he would love to get into that. So we'll see if anybody is interested in a quick response, and then maybe we can tie back in on that question again in the afternoon panel as well.
Yes, I recommend that you get into the website of a public hearing that was carried out by AER about a year ago, and it's a bit boring to go through a 1 week of hearing, but the whole hearing was dedicated to odors, and there is testimony of experts on odors of a community that has endured them for quite a while, and it's quite enlightening what material that appears there, and it's all public.
All right, we have a few more questions then for the panel. So any other presentations that took place this morning, feel free, if you have some cross-cutting questions, that'd be great as well for more than one person.
So my question is a general one for George and John, relates to a little bit to Bori's question. If you're going to plan ambient and environmental effects monitoring programs, you have to understand what emissions are going into the air and being deposited. And George, you mentioned that there's a lot of uncertainty around some emission sources. And I know, John, you've been doing some work over the last 5 years trying to address some of that uncertainty. And so my question is, what are your thoughts on how we address this issue in a systematic way? And in answering that question, if you could perhaps touch on some of these emission sources like flaring, diverter stacks, fugitive emissions, volume sources that are very difficult to get a handle on, and we really don't know, and yet we know that, for example, flaring is a significant source of emissions. So your thoughts on how we move forward and address this uncertainty?
I'm a detailed guy, not a generic one. If you're dealing with flares, for example, there are a number of things. As flares essentially is a very difficult source to measure. Combustion take place outside on the open, and it's not a controlled combustion. It has a lower combustion efficiency than enclosed flares. They are, by the way, they are enclosed flares too, where you control all the things. You have the exhaust out. Many urban centers have used those enclosed flares for example, for landfill gases, okay? But nevertheless, on the open flares, which is the standard in the oil and gas industry, there is some basic set of numbers that appear in the reporting kits that are being used for reporting emissions, but that is not all what is in open literature. For example, you don't have in the factors, and they are EPA factors for that matter, there is no PAHs in the factors for flares, but yet there are PAHs in other factors, for example, for CATEF, California Air Resources Board, and this would allow to have a better approach. I'm not saying that you're going to decrease the uncertainty, it's a big factor, but at least you would widen the database of possible emission from flares, if that's what you're interested in.
John, did you?
Yeah, I'd add to that we're really looking at an iterative process between emissions measurements at the source and inferences at the receptors that I kind of alluded to in my final what we can do with the data sets. And this is how we've discovered things that we never thought of. Things like cooking, things like cold starts, things like certain, not necessarily up in this region, but in other countries, certain festivals that they do. We kind of need to keep at it. We need to do a realistic look at both what we see at receptors and what we see at, and then use that to help guide us. Same thing applies to odors, I think, because they have a kind of a unique chemical composition that, again, can be a fingerprint for where their sources are and also what their effects might be. And I think we'll hear more about that in the afternoon. So it's kind of a continuous process whereby we use our receptor measurements to identify a potential source, then we want to go back and try to simulate as much as we can what those things we are measuring at the receptors.
Okay, great. That microphone down there is working. I checked it, so we're sooner or later. Okay, we'll hop over here.
Good morning. It's Andy Boyd with Alberta Fish and Game Association. It's a question from the pardon me, the simplified water monitoring model presentation. One of the final slides in the presentation admitted that groundwater influences are not effectively factored in to the hydrological assessment currently. Given the high percentage of wetland and muskeg land cover in the oil sands area, ignoring this obvious interaction between surface water and shallow groundwater would appear to be a serious shortcoming. Can anyone on the panel comment on how close we are, both in time and probably more importantly on policy or political commitment into obtaining that data so that we can get a complete look and approach to water management in the oil sands area?
Is this on? Yeah. Great question. Thanks very much. The water balance was developed under RAMP, or was used under RAMP, and at that time, RAMP did not include groundwater. And it doesn't mean that it shouldn't have been. And I know when Jocelyn started to become developed, that ESRD was in the process of developing or looking at the regional groundwater data and where it's at and what would be required to include it. I'm not a groundwater person, so I'm not sure where that is at this point, but I'm sure there are people in this room that would know more and be able to answer that question for you in more detail.
Okay, I'll go. We do have someone over here, so I want to encourage them to do that. So.
Good morning, Bob Cameron, chairman of the Peace WPAC and member of the Air Component Advisory Committee. In considering air quality monitoring and financing it, the costs of capital costs and installation and operation of stations are important. So my question is about hydrometric stations. What is the per unit cost of the hydrometric stations that you've used in the presentation and the data you've collected? Cost per unit per annum would be a ballpark figure to get an understanding of what the comparisons across media might be?
I think actual numbers, I'm not sure. I think the people to talk to from the federal side would be the Water Survey of Canada. They do keep records of the costs of running their hydrometric stations. In Joslin, there was a few new sites that were set up. One down at M9, down close to Emberers, actually north of Emberers now, I believe it is, and a new one on the upper steep bank. Actual costs, I'm not sure. It's also shared between province and federal jurisdictions and that sort of thing, but Water Survey of Canada would have a better idea. I don't know if my colleague would have any.
Yeah, it's not a simple question to answer. It really depends on, you know, what the access of how to get to the station, if you're using a helicopter versus a truck or a snowmobile in the wintertime, and you know, what the site looks like. How do you have to armor the station or not? Or so there's a lot of variables that go into kind of costing of a station.
So in consideration of the impact of air quality, Dr. Leahy and others, Dr. Percy, have always talked about co-located measurements where you're measuring effects and measuring the inputs. So I'm assuming that at each hydrometric station you're also doing water quality measurements to relate quality to volume of the water body. Is that generally a system that applies in the water component? Being quite familiar with the air.
Yes, in general in Joslin, most of the water component is harmonized for so at most hydrometric stations there's also benthos and sediment data collected and water quality, and the fish component is also tried to co-locate, and we usually share helicopter landing spaces and access and try to harmonize as best we can.
Okay, great. And if someone in the audience does have some information on costs, who knows, if they could, during some of the breaks or whatever, go and have a chat with the fellow there, that'd be great.
Thanks. Charlie Richmond here, representing Sierra Club Canada National in this case. My thunder's been stolen a bit by a previous question, but I was puzzled in looking at your symposium that groundwater didn't appear. And especially puzzled because I noticed that in June 2013, AESRD did roll out a Lower Athabasca Region groundwater management framework. So I'm wondering, you know, what's the status of that, and is it intended to wrap that program up in Emira as well? Thanks.
Anybody have anything? Anil, if you don't mind. Thank you. So Anil Gupta is with Emira.
Hello, my name is Anil Gupta. I'm with Emira. I was sure there will be some questions around the groundwater, and thank you for asking those questions. Certainly, some work has been done under the JOSM related with groundwater. So we are doing some focus work that is related with surface water groundwater interaction. And the plan is to incorporate a fully blown groundwater component in 2015-16 program or 16-17 program of the JOSM. Yeah, we know that there is a groundwater management framework for the lab, and a framework is being developed for the SSRP. So whatever monitoring will be required to include the groundwater component and the JOSM, or to make sure that we have enough groundwater monitoring to support these groundwater management frameworks, we will complete all that monitoring. Thanks.
So was that the specific program you were talking about then, that you were asking if it was still running?
This was general for the Lower Athabasca.
Okay, so the Lower Athabasca general question, you're saying the LARP does have?
Yeah, in the lab actually we have almost a full-blown groundwater monitoring component basically that will cater the need of a groundwater monitoring framework for the lab. So they are more than, if I remember correctly, they are almost like 40 groundwater monitoring wells are there, and we are aggressively doing the groundwater monitoring to make sure that we have the reporting data for the large groundwater management framework. But
Okay, and so his point there at the end was that if it's such an important issue, but it's not really it doesn't have presentations, and I think Amir is nodding that they're aware of that, and so they'll maybe be able to address that a little later on.
yeah, I think for some of the presentation what you guys are seeing today, and those are the presentation directly funded by the JOSM, but some of the components, for example, the large groundwater monitoring that is happening right now is not directly funded by under the JOSM, but it was more funded by provincial MMD budget. So that's why you are not seeing some of those presentations right now here.
Okay, Brad? Over there.
This might be partly a question for Jim, but I think anyone can take it. What is the state of, I guess, fire suppression in the oil sands region, and could that be seen as a human footprint?
So, fire suppression, the way we're realizing fire suppression is having older forests, and we're going to have the conditions in the lower Athabasca for the next 50 years are every year, year over year, the forests are going to be older. Forestry won't catch up to that. And that's a consequence of a good half a century of fire suppression. I think it'd be a pretty hard sell, and this is probably stakeholder driven and perspective, but fire suppression as a footprint, no. I mean, I've never heard it suggested. Some, depending on the critter, will characterize, for example, caribou is typically lumped, fires themselves are typically lumped in as a footprint or as a driver for caribou populations and caribou population models. RSFs take into account, resource selection functions for woodland caribou and the oil sands take into account recent fire history. But no, I don't think I've never heard any suggestion from a stakeholder group that fire suppression be characterized as a land use or a human footprint in the kind of wildlife and ecological monitoring world.
Good.
Hi, Jim. I'm really glad to see ABMI is starting to work on attribution of industrial sectors. I think that's really excellent. When you talked a little bit about sort of rolling up these per unit effects to both sort of, effect sizes and also impacts on populations, I wonder if ABMI has given some thought about how to do that. And what I'm talking about particularly is whether you're making the assumption of just additive effects, so just adding up these individual sector effects, or whether you want to look at interactions. And I say that given that recent meta-analyses in both terrestrial and marine environments have suggested that over 77% of cumulative effects are actually interactive and not additive.
Yeah, I mean, luckily I get to deflect a bit of the question. So Jim Sheik is giving a talk on that will deal, I hope, I'll put him on the spot. We'll deal with this tomorrow. But no, I mean, we've looked at it both in an additive and in an interactive way. I think some of the complicating discussion, there's a paper published through our group on the topic, but some of the complicating factors are which footprint goes in first, and then it will depend on which footprint goes in first, how the other industries will then come in and operate on that land base. So the type of transportation infrastructure that goes in first. So we are looking at those interactions. Having said that, I would be surprised if the results of that came to much more than additive. I mean, there might be incremental advances in our understanding or ability to predict and model, but by and large, most of the effects should be just accounted for by the addition of agriculture and the energy industry and the forest industry operating on the land base at the same time.
Okay. Is that okay? Over here.
I have a question for Stephen. I might be missing something here, but you mentioned that one of the benefits of the water balance approach, despite it being perhaps unsophisticated, is that it allows you to not have that need for that historical data. But I had thought earlier in your presentation you mentioned that we do have historical data for that region. We have 30 years of records, I believe you said, so I don't know if I'm missing something there.
Yeah, you're right. We do have a lot of historical data. they're sort of unrelated. The data is there, it's available. The water balance in itself doesn't need it, so which is a benefit, because for some of the watersheds that we do the water balance on, we only have 5 years worth of data, so there's no way to really do a statistical trend analysis, for example. And we did do some statistical assessments of specific watersheds that had longer term data for them, but what we found is that the development is such that it's not point source, so it varies over time and it continually increases, so to really use a statistical analysis isn't that helpful because the background noise is just too great. So kind of using a year-by-year approach seemed to work better, or provide a better analysis or better results.
Okay.
Mike Nemeth with Alberta Water Smart. These questions are for Ian and Stephen, I guess. Throughout the modeling work that you've been doing and the data that you've collected, are those models and that data publicly available? Like, can anyone use it, access it? And have you guys, in terms of the modeling, I think Ian, you mentioned you developed a hydrological model. Did you guys look at any of the models that had been applied throughout the basin, whether it was through EIAs or whatever, or did you guys create a brand new model for this study?
A lot of the models that are used are available to anybody. And in terms of the water quality model, the EFDC, all the work that Environment Canada is doing with that model in conjunction with the province will be going over to Emera and stakeholders so that can be used, because there's a tremendous amount of work that's gone into understanding the flows and the dynamics, equilibriums that occur. So that is available. We used many different models on the 1D and the hydrology to determine. If you use just one model, as you know, you can get widely different results than if you use a different model. So in many cases, multiple models were used. Again, I'm not the modeler per se, so I'm not sure which ones they looked at, but multiple models were looked at in the hydrology, and certainly from the climatic standpoint, we used a lot of the different global models.
So is there a place someone could go to find those?
Well, I mean, things like, I believe like Mike and CRISP and things like that are available. They've been developed, a lot of them by, say, the US EPA type of thing. To go to, it's the use of these models is very complex, and so the outputs and everything that goes into those will be provided through Emera in the future in terms of the EFDC. Having the contacts and keeping down my number if you're interested in speaking with the modelers and what they've used, and I'm happy to provide your name to them, and you can deal directly with them and see if you can where they've gotten and developed this information from the models.
Do you have anything to add, Stephen?
Well, as far as the water balance is concerned, it's the equation is published every year in the Jocelyn report, and the data is available online. So really anybody can reproduce it or take it and develop it. It's a very simplistic model, so there's no software for it.
I should say too that the model, I didn't mention it, but for the sediment transport, the MOBED and RIVFLOC, that model and all the parameters and data sets that went into setting up that model will also be provided to Emera at the end of this fiscal year.
Hi, my name is Andrew Reed with the Pembina Institute. I think everyone in the room can definitely say that there's some excellent research going on that's adding to the wealth of information that's necessary for the development in the province. One question that I do have that's always at the back of my mind is how this information is making it to the decision makers in approving projects, and how that information is being relayed. And for each of the panelists, whether they're being approached by the provincial government to gain access to this information to consider projects, or if they're being approached by industry for that information as well to put together their case for the project. So just curious about how this information is flowing to the decision makers in the province.
The models that we use help to inform decision makers. For example, when we sample in the environment and we get a concentration of variable X, we know it's that in that point in time. The model will help to look at how does that change with time? How does it relate to CCME guidelines? So there's a certain level of a particular contaminant. What is the probability of exceedance over the year, over 10 years, over 20 years, over 30 years of exceeding that? So is it really low? Is it important to be looking at from a policy and a management standpoint, or is it something that we should really key in on? So I think that's what some of the modeling can do and get back to the decision makers in policy.
And so, sorry, go ahead. Did you want to add? Because I think that the point being, so are people approaching you? Are you approaching others? How is the information getting from the good work you're doing out to people who can use it for decision making? I think is where he's going.
As far as the work that we're involved in, it's part of a regulatory report that gets handed out to both industry and Alberta Environment, or the Alberta Energy Regulator, every year. So.
How about the dust one?
Well, the dust one, basically our role is to kind of get the information, suggest how it might be used. But again, this integrative process is a tough one because it, as I pointed out in my final part of my presentation, means bringing together a lot of skills and information. In fact, we see a lot of the types of mapping information that is probably very applicable to this, and so there probably needs to be some unification of it. Another thing that we've tried to do in our Air and Waste Management Association is to put together a critical review each year on a topic, and this might be a good one to recruit somebody to put together. These are very difficult to do when you try to integrate this information in such a way that it's consolidated together, but it seems there's a big enough body of scientific knowledge that somebody ought to take that on and try to do it.
Yeah, Jim?
Okay, I'll just add, I'll give you 3 examples coming out of the ABMI's work in the oil sands region. There are others, but I'll just focus on 3. One for the government. So this data is right now being used to help support the development and implementation of the biodiversity management framework under regional land use planning for the lower Athabasca. So it's helping to identify what the appropriate indicators are and long-term thresholds for the health of the region. So that will become part of the constellation of management frameworks, surface water, air, groundwater, tailings pond, and I'm missing one of the other water ones, surface water quantity, I think, and the biodiversity management framework. So this data is being fed right into that process, and that's been going on for the better part of a year. We also work with Alberta Pacific Forest Industry, ALPAC, to help them with their stewardship commitments and their reporting, being able to document what the stewardship looks like across the entire FMA, and they've got an additional challenge of being a forest operator on a landscape that is also heavily targeted for energy extraction, so the energy infrastructure that goes with it. And then finally, I think in the example of the presentation, some of the tools working with the energy sector, the Synovises of the world, to develop the specific targeted tools to advance some of the caribou restoration, seismic line restoration activities.
Great. You have another question over here?
Not so much a question, a comment. I'm Monique Dubé. I'm the Chief Environmental Scientist at the Alberta Energy Regulator. I'd like to thank you for the good work that you presented here this morning. I think our success, our combined success as IRMS partners, is really going to be predicated on taking the recommendations into implementation. And of course, the regulator plays a significant role there. So what I would like to table, and maybe this is a conversation that AER can Jay, we can have a conversation about, but what I'd like to do is have some sort of an implementation discussion forum amongst our groups where the key conclusions and recommendations that you're making, we can look at that in the context of the mandate of the regulator and how we might be able to put some of that into implementation, because if we don't implement, then we will all fail, and I think we need to facilitate that translation. Any comments on that from the panel?
Have you had some experiences with integration already? What's working, what's not? Can I jump? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is AER, Emera, ABMI, the GOA, and I'm much more familiar with interacting and working with planning, to a lesser degree policy environments in the government of Alberta, and that's been our experience, so very closely tied to the planning experience. And I think one way to effectively move forward with this is to actually have a much tighter relationship. How do I say it? There's a lack of trust, and I think in some cases a lack of respect for what each of the organizations or institutions brings to this conversation. And one of the ways to break that down is to put people at the table together on a long-term project. So rather than inviting one another across to different initiatives, co-develop the initiatives and have trust that one another can bring their respected expertise to the development of that. That's just one of the ways that we're finding. I think it's working in the case of land use planning, at least it's working right now. That model might be used in other places as well.
I guess I'd just like to challenge that a little bit and maybe push you to consider if there are recommendations related to implementables, that those are highlighted in a central forum at a frequency that we agree to. I think we need to get beyond the individual studies and get into that translation exercise. So perhaps we can take that offline then and consider what mechanisms might exist for us to utilize the knowledge that's being generated. Thank you.
I'll just one quick follow-up comment.
Yep.
And I get to push back a bit. So I guess I understand that model. I understand that recommendation. I wonder quite a lot about whether or not those recommendations can be, rather than waiting for one party to try and figure out what the needs of another party are and then make recommendations to that effect, to co-develop them, to better understand by sitting together, understand what the data and the research is showing, understand what the needs are, co-develop how that information might be used. So I mean, I think it comes to the same point, it just might be more efficient.